This week on The Futurists.
I'm just not sure what, if people can fully grasp, if you live in, the US or Europe, what it's like to have quote unquote 5 billion neighbors. You really have to come and experience it. And that's part aesthetically. That's part of what this last 10 years has been. Even as someone who was born in India but grew up outside of India, I really made the most of having those 5 billion neighbors over the last decade. So there's a lot of dynamism built in. So we're not predicting that Miami is going to sink. In fact, in many ways, we are, no, I don't want to say doing the opposite. It really depends on the time scale. If you just take a typical climate risk company, they're going to say, oh my God, all of South Florida is screwed. That's not how we approach it. We say, well, actually, if they do X amount of infrastructure spending in coastal areas and they do this kind of new real estate, well, then actually Miami does remain livable longer than we think. So we can't rule out human ingenuity. We try to code for that ingenuity and price that ingenuity.
Welcome back to The Futurists. I'm in the hot seat with my pal, Robert Tercek. We're going to be talking to Parag Khanna today. He's a leading global strategy advisor. He's a global citizen, and he's a best-selling author. He's the CEO of a climate-focused business called Climate Alpha. Closely related to that is his latest book, Move, where people are going for a better future, which he published last year, preceded by The Future is Asian: Commerce, Conflict, and Culture in the 21st Century. Parag Khanna, welcome to The Futurists.
Well, thank you both so much.
It's great to see you again, Parag.
How is Singapore? Yeah.
Sunny and 28 degrees Celsius as always.
Yeah, exactly. And Friday afternoons at 4:00, you can depend on a thunderstorm.
That's exactly
when you're
right.
waiting for the taxi, right?
Exactly.
Well, we've all spent time in Singapore, but you're based there. How long have you been in Singapore?
It's been exactly 10 years as of this past summer, actually. We've done sabbaticals in and out and, long trips and stints, but, it's more and more the place where we call home. Can't imagine going home at this point anywhere else. And it's become more and more of, what we could probably agree is the sort of capital of the future. I've called it capital of Asia. And now it's sort of capital of Asia and capital of the future, all rolled into one. And we've just witnessed this incredible, evolution and dynamism of this place in just the past decade. And it's been great to be here and have a front row seat to all of that.
Singapore is an astounding city, and it's obviously benefiting a lot from Hong Kong's more recent fall from grace, particularly in respect to regional headquarters and so forth. But another element of this, which sort of closely relates to your second book, is, Singapore is able to make some of these bets because of its proximity to China and the fact that soon China will be the world's leading global economy. How much of that weighs into your decision-making in terms of you being based in Singapore?
Well, there's a couple of things there. One is that, my approach to Asia is a much broader geographical framework in which Asia is more than just China. And a lot of people, to this day in markets, in the business world, see Asia as just sort of China writ large. But we would not have moved to China, neither to mainland nor to Hong Kong. We wanted to be in a city that considers itself neutral, that acts in the ways that I kind of call multi-alignment, being friends with everyone. Obviously, an Anglophone city, a very safe city, and all of those other kind of virtues that one associates with this place. Proximity to China has been very useful, but I was traveling to China frequently even before moving here. Most certainly in terms of this city economic strategy, it hasn't hitched itself only to the China train. Remember that Singapore is one of the so-called tiger economies that grew much faster, much earlier, developed and modernized much sooner than China. To be very, very clear in terms of the chronology, and this is a matter of factual record as well as lore, Singapore is the inspiration for China. The Chinese miracle, such as we know it, is a result of Deng Xiaoping, visiting Singapore and other cities that were Chinese populated or just broadly around the Pacific Rim and seeing Japan and the tiger economies develop and then seeking to initiate those reforms exactly 40 plus years ago. So it's an important point because a lot of people say that what can small countries teach big countries that doesn't happen. I'm like, wait a minute. The
Yeah.
single most important episode of national modernization in any of our lifetimes is exactly a case of the largest country in the entire world learning from one of the exact absolute smallest countries in the entire world. So I'm not sure why people say that. And obviously, the more we look at the future and governance driven by data and data management and other kinds of practices, the more you can scale those learnings from a place like Singapore.
It's a really extraordinary story. I had the occasion to talk to, I had an audience with the King of Bahrain a few years back. And at the time, we spoke about Singapore. And he had tremendous respect for Singapore. He said back in the early 1960s, the two countries had similar GDP and similar population. But since that time, Singapore has simply outstripped every country, not just his kingdom, but every country in terms of the improvement to GDP and the living standards and so forth. What were the factors that drove you to decide to live there? You had the luxury of choosing to live anywhere in the world. And at the time when I met you a few years ago, actually, 3 couples that I knew had moved from the United States to Singapore. Tell me some of the factors that went into that decision for you personally.
Mm-hmm. Well, we were already expats. We were living in London, sort of on an academic stint. Both my wife and I had done our PhDs at LSE in London, and our second child was born. So we decided that we needed to go, to a place where childcare was more sort of, accessible, affordable, convenient. We certainly were thinking about, at the time, this being early Obama administration, post-financial crisis, what's the mood and the vibe, and where do we sense that it's going to be a good place to live, professionally and so forth. And, as an expat, kind of the first step out of the country is always the hardest. So just relocating to London. But beyond that, we really could have gone anywhere because we were already abroad. And then we kind of looked and said, I had already done work for the Singapore government. I had already been a fellow at the New School here back in the mid 2000s when I was researching my first book. I knew the place well. And, we had very good relationships. So we started kind of just having those conversations, and they made it very, attractive for us to come and to be here, to settle here, relocate here. And indeed, as you said, many, many other people, first of all, came way before us, very illustrious, well-known people like Jim Rogers and, in general, as a former
Jim's
British colony,
yeah.
It has a very large, Western population. We already knew quite a few others. I even have relatives who had lived here. So it became pretty straightforward, quite frankly. It was almost a fait accompli to come here. But indeed, knowing all along, as I did even prior to, that this was kind of, a place that was doing the right things. And so, I had a sufficient kind of understanding of what's going on here and how to be able to access the region and kind of have in this radius. I call it the kind of one laptop charge radius. How many places, how many people can you see on a flight within and this is a pre kind of new MacBook Air, like 13-hour battery. I'm thinking more like 4-hour battery. You can reach a good, 3-4 billion people in that radius. So when I did the Asia book a couple of years ago, I dedicated it to my 5 billion neighbors. And I'm just not sure what, if people can fully grasp, if you live in, the US or Europe, what it's like to have quote unquote 5 billion neighbors. You really have to come and experience it. And that's part aesthetically. That's part of what this last 10 years has been. Even as someone who was born in India, but grew up outside of India, I really made the most of having those 5 billion neighbors over the last decade. And I think that you just have to experience it firsthand.
You grew up in the US, right?
Yeah, partially. So first grew up in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and then in New York, and finished high school in Germany.
So definitely a global citizen. When you are, obviously, if as Rob and I live both here in the States, at least, part-time, and you speak to Americans about China, there's a lot of political connotations to that, as there are more broadly, around the world. But, how do you explain to Westerners the potential of Asia? I know you've written about it, but for those that are skeptical, that are very pro-Western models, how do you explain the advantages or the benefits that Asia is going to have in the 21st century?
Well, being sort of explaining Asia isn't necessarily to be anti-Western as a Western product, myself. And so being pro-Western also shouldn't mean being anti-Asian. And one of the obviously key entry points into that conversation is to say that, if you look at the bottom line, the revenue of most major Western multinational companies, what would that be absent Asia? Right. And then China within Asia, of course, it would be a whole lot less. So we do live in a world that's highly interdependent, and the economic fate and fortunes of much of the West are tied to the rise of Asia. And there is that symbiosis. So it's not an either or thing. And that's also the difference between people who view geopolitics as a inherently conflictual process by which one hegemon must war against its rising challenger, and the winner of that duel becomes the next hegemon. And that's not actually how the kind of grand sweep of history works. It partially explains partial dynamics of the past 150 years. It doesn't explain anything more than that.
I agree.
World history is multipolar. World history is multi-civilizational. And we are re-entering a multipolar, multi-civilizational world. And Asia is a multipolar region in that multipolar world. That's with China, India, Japan, other great civilizations that have populated this region and defined it for the past 5, 6, 7,000 years. And that's going to be the case now more than ever. And just lastly, part of it is, and this is not about being if you will, pugnacious or anything, but just to get people in the right frame of mind, because there can be that kind of that sort of self-referential default view that, the West is still the center, America is still the center. I just remind people the facts. Most of the human population is Asians in Asia. Most of the world economy is Asian economies. It's not that Asia is sort of kind of rising and eventually be the center, right? It's not about the rise of the rest. If you sit in Asia, you are the rest. You, meaning yourselves, and you are the rest, right? Asia is not the rest. And language like that in plain American English, is kind of how I try to explain to people what it is like to be here. You may still disagree in terms of narrative, perspective, polemics, whatever, but facts are facts. And so that's how I've started to see it by being.
Parag, it's in the United States, we very often see or hear about China when people are talking about Asia. It's a point you just made a moment ago. In a way, we kind of airbrush out or gloss over the fact that there's large countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, India, with enormous populations and enormous economic heft, very important growing countries as well, where China's population isn't really necessarily growing. But in the United States, it seems almost necessary for politicians to speak to it in this simplified fashion with a very simple black and white contrast. And the U.S. always seems to rely on an external enemy in order to create internal cohesion and maybe distract people away from any of the internal issues, of which there are quite a few that could address. And we could talk about many things. I'm sure you've noticed this in your trips back to the United States, where a country like Singapore is affordable, it's very safe. There's very little crime. Your children can walk around the streets safely at night. And what you get for your money is probably better than most other places. Public education is available. Healthcare is good. Yep. Right. And in the United States, many of those things are not available, and they're certainly not equally available to everybody here. Talk to me a little bit about your perception as a person of the world, not just from Singapore, but as a man of the world. Talk about that perception and maybe some of the blind spots that you notice that the U.S. or the U.K. or other nations have when they consider the rest of the world.
So there's a lot going on there. I think you're kind of addressing both the individual perspective and experience of lifestyle, as well as the big geopolitical questions about how we perceive Asia and America and China within that or distinct from that. So maybe starting with the personal level. Again, as you said, I could live anywhere in the world, I've traveled just about everywhere. And there must be some reason why we decided to settle here and haven't left here, especially as a peripatetic person, who's generally on the move a lot. So there are those virtues, which again, I think that firsthand experience really matters. When people come here, they don't want to leave, right? No one is forcing them to stay, but they don't want to leave. And there's obviously a lot of reasons for that. Now, this is, again, an exceptional country, an exceptionally small country. So much like I don't think that China represents Asia, nor, of course, does Singapore represent Asia. But in one sense, and this also gets at the primary question, there is an appreciation for how the ideal form of government is not necessarily the sort of Fukuyama model, end of history, Western style capitalist liberal democracy, without any of the kind of bumper guards or guardrails around it. And what I've written about more recently is what I call kind of Asian democratic technocracy. I still very strongly believe in democracy. I believe there should be universal mandatory voting, like Australia has, Singapore has too. I believe that multi-party parliamentary democracy is the highest and most accountable and most legitimate form of government. There's zero doubt about any of that. That said, there needs to be some institution sort of entities within the executive branch of government that provide that long-term kind of vision and agenda, where you have kind of, again, a sort of commitment to certain ideals and goals without changing them every year or two. Because what we are doing right now in the US and in much of Europe is sort of half building roads, right? Are we going to have universal healthcare? Are we not going to have universal healthcare? Are we going to commit to infrastructure or not? And these kinds of things. And that doesn't work as someone who thinks long term. How can a futurist, have a long term vision if it's, going to be interrupted? So there is something to be said for, again, an accountable technocracy, which is not, again, to say that it operates at the expense of democracy. A place like Singapore, of course, is not considered to be a fully liberal, fully free democracy. But what it is, because it's inherited those British parliamentary traditions, it is actually a multi-party system. It does have competitive elections, but it does have a very strong technocratic executive branch that sets certain, guideposts and certain rules and norms. Some of them are too onerous. I'm myself critical of those, but what I see them is in the context of their own evolution and where they are at any point in time and what degree of openness and liberalism they're willing to stomach. But the key thing is that the end of history is not therefore that they must eventually become like us, and will not. Right. And on behalf of the 5 billion people of Asia, the kind of yardstick, the metric, the goalpost that most societies have around here, going as far as precisely Bahrain, as you mentioned, is to be like Singapore. Right. Mm-hmm. And, I started observing that again, 15, 20 years ago. I was just an early 20-something American backpacker, doing my research. And I heard the Kazakhs and the Saudis and the Indonesians and everyone else saying, Lee Kuan Yew's got it figured out. We want to build our political system to look like that. And I wrote that in the mid 2000s. At this point, it's, I think, pretty much obvious to everyone. And it is not because of our internal decay and our own self-delegitimation, just to be absolutely clear, because we've already had a number of political cycles where people have said, aha, well, once we get rid of Bush and, he's replaced by John Kerry, which didn't work out in 2004, or once Obama wins and, we will then be the shining city on a hill again in 2008. Again, that's such an unbelievably self-centric, narrow perspective. Right.
Without the investment in infrastructure, without changing policy. Yeah, exactly.
When you travel around Europe, and in particular in South Asia, you encounter quite a few people who are quite skeptical of the American style of government. The deeply divisive politics, the two-party system, these entrenched two parties that kind of trade the White House periodically. But, the U.S. president doesn't have that much control. We really need a stronger Congress. Our Congress hasn't been very functional in the last 2 decades. And so there's some deep skepticism about that. And this notion of kind of a heavy hand, sort of a guided democracy, if you will, with a lot of industrial policy to back it up.
Well,
so synchronize the economy. That has a lot of traction in other parts of the world. I think Americans would be very surprised to learn that, how widespread that perspective is.
Even Singapore's success with Tercek, and their infrastructure investment and so forth has really become a model that we see. Certainly Abu Dhabi and Dubai and Saudi and others now following. ADIA in out of the UAE and so forth. That you really need, if you're going to modernize your economy, if you're going to be the quintessential smart economy and have a smart city like Singapore, you have to make significant investment in the people, in the infrastructure, in the way you think about technology infused into the economy. And you just don't have that sort of dialogue in the United States, frankly.
It's just not stable enough to do that. So Parag, now you've published this book, Move. The title of the book is Move, where people are going for a better future. And given the context of what we're talking about, we've just been kind of skipping around the globe comparing systems. How much of that factors into Move? Is that what the book is about, or is the book more focused on climate and how to live safely with climate change?
No, I think that, there's what I do is to kind of look at the last 100,000 years of human history and the relocation of peoples and the reasons why the fundamental buckets or drivers. And it is, of course, political, it's demographic, it's economic, technological, and also environmental. So I try and create a complex picture that weaves all of that together. But in particular, I focus on today's young generation because they are the kind of most mobile generation in human history. And therefore, their preferences are driven very much by, seeking political stability, an affordable lifestyle, good educational opportunity, and a safe environment. All of the above, not just one thing. So climate plays a big role.
Good internet access.
Yes, exactly, and cheap beer.
Yes,
though, that's a risky thing to forecast. I would imagine. In the early '90s, I moved to Hong Kong, and I lived there for a couple of years. And at the time, there was this kind of friendly rivalry between Hong Kong and Singapore. And at that time, you could compare the two systems. And actually, Hong Kong came out favorably for many people. And it was because it was viewed as a more dynamic economy. It was even freer in some respects than Singapore. It was kind of like the Wild Wild East. You could go set up a company in about 3 hours in Hong Kong. And then the view was also from the time I was there, just in a few years, it was going to be part of China. And that was looked at as a great big opportunity. Now, you can imagine someone in your position writing a book saying Hong Kong, therefore, is a really great place to move to. That forecast would not have held up very well over the last 5 years. How are you able to make a forecast like that with confidence? What's your methodology for predicting or recommending where to go to?
Fortunately, I didn't recommend moving to Hong Kong, and I didn't take that advice myself, I might add. But it is actually one of the case studies in the book of complexity, because this project started out as wanting to forecast the places that will be the winners. And then I realized that that's not how it works. What you're looking for is kind of shifting goalposts and yardsticks of what qualifies as a livable, stable, desirable place, and people will move among those places. So I came to the conclusion that we will not just move, we will be moving. And I think that is really the key thing. So, for example, Hong Kong was attractive at a certain point in time, but you could, of course, have identified that there were risk factors on the horizon, like the handover to China and inevitable pressures on their democratic political system, for example. So when people say that, Canada is just going to be a climate paradise, so to speak, well, don't be so sure, because what happens when lots of people go and overrun, those parts of Canada, then suddenly it becomes a nightmare. And they haven't built enough infrastructure. You have, cultural tensions and violence, these kinds of things that they're not used to. So, what I kind of focus on is the complexity. The process, as the method is really about complex systems and looking at how these different factors affect each other and whether or not the place itself maintains that balance of sort of ticking the boxes across all of those criteria simultaneously. If it fails to do so, it will lose people.
Yeah. Who's your audience for a book like this? Like, who do you expect is going to be reading it and benefiting from it?
I mean, the title would suggest that it's people who are in the market to sort of relocate. But of course, it's much more than that. I'm not a tour guide, right? This is fundamentally, it's political science, it's sociology, it's economics, all of those things into one. And of course, futurism, you might say. So I tend to, I think with each subsequent book, focus on an ever broader audience. For example, this book was adapted to the human geography curriculum of the AP sort of class. So there's an AP human geography guide, and the AP human geography course in America is one of the fastest growing APs, 200 plus thousand students every single year who take it. And so, that was actually by design, in the sense that fundamentally this is a book about human geography, even if it doesn't read that way, even if it reads like a tour of the world and, evaluating places based upon whether or not they stack up and how they're coping with complexity. But, very fundamentally, I really, in my heart of hearts, I think about geography from many different angles. And in this book, I explicitly wanted to tackle human geography.
Yeah. So listen, I want to get into the whole climate affecting people movement and so forth after the break. But let's have a quick break, Parag. And after the break, let's get into the potential stress on economies from eco-refugees and how this might play out in cities like Miami and Shanghai and Guangzhou and Calcutta and so forth, who are potentially going to have some problems. You're listening to The Futurists. We have our guest, Parag Khanna, on. You're with Rob Tercek and myself. We'll be right back after this quick break.
Welcome to Breaking Banks, the #1 global fintech radio show and podcast. I'm Brett King.
And I'm Jason Henricks. Every week since 2013, we explore the personalities, startups, innovators, and industry players driving disruption in financial services.
From incumbents to unicorns, and from cutting-edge technology to the people using it to help create a more innovative, inclusive, and healthy financial future. I'm JP Nichols, and this is Breaking Banks.
Welcome back. You're listening to The Futurists with Brett King and myself, Rob Tercek. And today our guest is Parag Khanna, who's been to us from Singapore. Parag's been talking to us about his perspective as a man of the world, a person who's lived in many different parts of the world, who voluntarily chose to move to Singapore as the ideal place. We talked a bit about that in the previous section. His recent book, Move, is all about predicting the future of places and the most desirable places where you might want to set up your own residence in the future. Now, one of the things that you do, Parag, is you run a consulting firm or forecasting firm, right? That's called Climate Alpha, that helps people make database decisions about real estate. And I'm really interested to hear about that, how that works, particularly in light of the rapid changes that we're experiencing in the climate.
Well, what we've done is to kind of do what's called risk-adjusted valuations. So we're looking at property values by location based not only upon the historical trends, population density, income, building permitting, climatization levels, also in our climate model. Broad climate models of pessimistic, optimistic base case scenarios, and looking at the relative impact of those models on geographies, and then forecasting what human behavior, market behavior is going to be. So we've done it for the entire country, the US, and now we're expanding globally. The ultimate vision is that you can put a pin drop place on the planet, literally any terrestrial location on Earth, and we would give you some kind of a forecasted asset value for property in that location.
And is this a service for individual residences, or is it for companies that are trying to set up a factory?
It can be. We haven't deployed our retail level kind of B2C dashboard, though we have it. And that would allow you to kind of Zillow style plug in your address, and we'd be able to tell you what your house will be worth in the year 2025 or 2030, whatever year target you choose. But it's mostly meant as a very large, because it's a software platform. So it's meant to take hundreds of thousands of buildings and locations simultaneously and model them individually and against each other, because again, it's all about complexity and relative performance of location.
Ultimately, are we going to face a dramatic rethink of real estate and commercial property as a result of climate change? Because you talked about Canada earlier and displacement of eco-refugees and so forth. This is obviously potentially a massive problem. The scale of this could be so large that it could be the greatest humanitarian disaster humanity has faced since the Black Plague, conceivably, eco-refugees from climate. Although there's still debate on how big that number is going to be. But ultimately, when you have sea level rise and all of and livability, survivability issues as a result of global warming and so forth, what does that do to the the viability of just the real estate business.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a big part of the book. And what we do as a company is looking at how the decimal place has been moving to the right over the centuries in terms of the number of people who migrate in any given century. From the 15th century through today, we've gone from millions to tens of millions, hundreds of millions. And now in this century, based perhaps potentially just purely on climate drivers alone, over 1 billion people could be displaced from their present domicile. And so that's exactly what I'm forecasting in this book. Where will the 9 billion people of the year 2040 live? Where physically in the world? Where will they start? Where will they finish? Why do they go to where they've gone? And how do they get there? Which places welcome them? Which places rejected them? And again, this is a book of scenarios, which is what futurism fundamentally has to be about, is scenarios. And I paint 4 scenarios in the book. 3 of them are not particularly positive, just to be clear. So, when Brett, you're saying this could be a disaster, yes, it could be. But I also obviously try and, paint that roadmap in the 4th scenario, which I call Northern Lights, about a world population that is more mobile, better able to circulate to geographies that are stable, but also more sustainable at the same time, so that we don't inflict this tragedy of the commons everywhere we go.
Parag, when I was a young man, I grew up in a world where it seemed like the world was expanding. The world of the East Soviet bloc was falling. The borders were coming down there. Other parts of the world that had been previously closed off were opening up, and it seemed like the whole world was opening up. But I recently spoke to a climate scientist who pointed out to me that for the first time in history, the world is actually shrinking. And she meant this quite literally, in the sense that climate change is now rendering certain parts of the world uninhabitable, and that will continue. So, the percentage of the surface we can live in is going to increase.
Arable land has decreased the last 50 years by 40% as well. Yeah.
What do you perceive as some of the biggest things that we should be genuinely concerned about on a global basis? Like, which regions do you view as kind of like the red hot regions?
Well, red hot can now mean multiple things. So I'm going to assume you mean the unlivable places. I call them vacant states in the book. The word state has a very literal meaning. It must have recognized borders and a permanent settled population. And there will be geographies, countries that will be completely abandoned and therefore no longer even definition of what a state is under international law. So I'm looking at exactly those questions. And there will be, again, it's not about entire countries that, where this phenomenon maps neatly onto our, more or less arbitrary post-colonial borders, but rather, based upon topography and climate modeling. So there will be parts of countries where people can no longer live, in the same way that no one lives in, much of the Sahara Desert or the empty quarter of, the sort of Persian Gulf. But there are, remember, at the same time that the world is shrinking, it's also shrinking demographically, right? We're reaching what I call peak humanity. And that's one of the points of departure of the book. We're only 8 billion people as of this year, and the world population is not, in my view, going to cross 10 billion. So most of the people who will ever live are alive today, and we don't have a spatial problem, right? We have 150 million square kilometers of land area in the world. And even if arable land is shrinking, the fact is that those 8 billion people can fit, in Manhattan Island, we can fit on the planet. And so I address the distributional question of what are the geographies, even if people had to leave all the vacant, unlivable, decimated geographies in the world, we'd still have plenty of space on the planet. Right. But where should people be redistributed, and how would we get to that point is the question I'm answering. And there's the answer to that is there's plenty of space. Right. We have more than enough space. But of course, this becomes a moral question, an ethical question, a political question, a diplomatic question, and a commercial question.
How soon should cities like Miami, I would say now, because Miami is identified as the city in the United States that's going to have the most economic impact from climate change.
It's flooding.
It's flooding. And of course, the very famously the previous governor of Florida did not allow the mention of climate change, which I think is head in the sand ostrich type stuff. But what would you say to people living in Miami? What would you say to the planners there in respect to what their strategy should be on real estate and the problems that Miami is going to face over the next 30 years?
Well, this is where, again, adaptation comes in, and not making firm predictions about a place, because there's a lot of adaptation that can be undertaken, and we try to model that into our algorithm. So if a place increases its adaptation spending, which is to say it builds seawalls and it does flood controls and it relocates people to higher ground and does all of these other things that a coastal city can do, well, then it's going to retain its livability, its characteristics for much further into the future than we think, based upon today's linear projections of what is store for that place. So there's a lot of dynamism built in. So we're not predicting that Miami is going to sink. In fact, in many ways, we are. No, I don't want to say doing the opposite. It really depends on the time scale. If you just take a typical climate risk company, they're going to say, "Oh my God, all of South Florida is screwed. Run for the hills." That's not how we approach it. We say, well, actually, if they do X amount of infrastructure spending in coastal areas, and they do this kind of new real estate, and so on and so forth, well, actually, and they keep taxes low, of course, and they attract young people. Well, then actually, Miami does remain livable longer than we think. So we can't rule out human ingenuity. We try to code for that ingenuity and price that ingenuity.
But obviously humans can adapt, but right now, there's been long-term denial. Now, obviously, it's going to get to a crunch point, and I think what we see with natural weather events and so forth occurring, the wildfires and so forth, and the continuous flooding, it's clear that we will have to adapt, but the question of who's going to pay for it always comes up in this conversation. So, but this has to sort of materially change economics as well. Is that one of the reasons you're a bit more bullish on Asia economically in the 21st?
Well, yes and no. I mean, Asia, by definition, not only has the most people, but the most people exposed to climate change, right? To flood, to heat waves, to rising sea levels, Maldives, droughts, and so forth, right? So, Asia's 5 billion people are hardly in the clear, and you don't really have an Asian climate policy, an Asian adaptation strategy. One of the weaknesses of the entire COP IPCC process has been that most of the funding was in mitigating efforts, which is, of course, important. I'm a strong advocate of climate change mitigation. I even support geoengineering. But adaptation is the here and now, right? It's what are you doing today to help those vulnerable people? So in Asia, you have, Indonesia saying that the capital city literally has to move from Jakarta to another island. That's an example of a very high cost, long time horizon kind of adaptation, but it's not a good thing to be in that situation. When I look at the United States, and you ask the question about who's going to pay for it, I look at Louisiana and I say, look, the population of Louisiana is declining. A lot of federal funding is going into rehabilitating power lines that cannot withstand the next season's storms, because they're built for Category 3 and they're getting to actually Category 4 or 5. And again, the people are moving away anyway. So we're literally, as taxpayers, throwing good money after bad, and we should not be doing that. So with the Biden infrastructure plan, and Build Back Better and all of these kinds of things, we should actually be focusing on reinforcing climate resilient areas, investing more capital there, and ensuring that there's adequate housing and quality infrastructure that's done in a sustainable fashion for the future populations that are inevitably going to settle in those resilient, stable areas. Of course, plenty of people can stay in places that are going to be, wiped out, but they shouldn't be doing so at taxpayer expense.
Interesting.
I would imagine that there's long-term planners at large corporations that are probably very concerned with the topics that you're focused on. I would imagine, for instance, that energy companies are going to pay attention, big manufacturing companies, the semiconductor companies, for instance. These are companies that make long-term bets because they're going to build infrastructure that is not something that you can rip up and move easily or at all, frankly. I would imagine that there's a tremendous amount of interest. Who are the people that are reading this book, and what has the reaction been to Move?
Or engage in Climate Alpha. Yeah.
Right. So with Climate Alpha, it's very much, it's property developers, it's real estate, private equity, it's pension funds, it's insurers. So they're basically very, very large institutional investors, managers, as well as real estate, family offices, everyone who's concerned about their own infrastructure, real estate portfolio, land holdings, property, and so forth. So it's kind of what you would expect. In terms of long-term thinking, sure, but for different reasons. I mean, energy companies are concerned about the price of oil and gas and what are the regulatory dynamics economics that are going to enable or prohibit, their drilling activities and production activities and so forth. Slightly less so, about their own contributions to a rapid energy transition. Whereas infrastructure, manufacturing, and so forth, and real estate are very concerned about this long-term question of the human geographic footprint. They want to know where the markets are going to be, right? Where will people be? Where will the customers be? And so by focusing on human geography, I'm giving sort of, tentative answers to what are the locations that are what I call the new civilizational centers. When we talk about cities, people have said, oh, COVID is the death of the city. Well, no, it's not. Just because New York lost people, it doesn't mean that Denver didn't gain people. Last time I checked, Denver is a city. And there's a perpetual competition among cities. It's not entirely zero sum the way sometimes it's made out to be. But the fact is that there will be thriving cities in the deep into the 21st century. They just may not be the same as the 20th century.
Well, let's build on that. Give us a forecast, if you will, because we like to ask our guests to close the show by giving us a fanciful forecast or a serious forecast, but something that's a little further up.
Yeah, take us into the year of 2050. Tell us what the world's going to be like.
I think it'll be much more nomadic. I think that people will have resettled, but be seasonally migrant and migrate those who can afford. And I think that there are obviously places of a more northern latitude around Canada, Europe, Russia, Japan, that will have larger populations than they do today. To use a kind of sci-fi term, I use one chapter of the book is called terraforming Siberia. And when we use the word terraforming, we usually mean colonizing other planets. But actually, there's large uninhabited swaths of our planet that we had come to come in and reside in. So I say we're going to terraform Siberia. Now, Siberia, as you probably know, is actually not a livable place, even as it is a quote unquote relative winner from climate change. You have peat bogs, you have obviously the taiga. You also have the permafrost thawing, and you have methane gas being released, poisonous gases. You have the wildfires last year. Fun fact, not so fun fact. Last year's forest fires in just Russia alone equaled the total land area of all the other forest fires on the entire rest of the planet Earth combined. And of course, there isn't, your fire department, your local Smokey Joe, whomever is not there in, the far east of Russia to put out all those fires. There's a long way to go. And that's why what I talk through in the book is, well, what is that future infrastructure in places that have agriculture that can be settled for certain seasons of the year, certain time periods? What kind of people are going to wind up there? It's going to be, South Asian farmers, just to give you one other prediction that relates to this terraforming. Again, because South Asia has among the worst climate profiles you can imagine. I anticipate the large South Asian diaspora. It already is, but far exceeding that of China, make it sort of print around the world as people flee many unlivable parts. And so I'm looking already at skills transfer agreements that Russia has with Indian farmers, that Romania has with Pakistani laborers. And I'm looking at how this South Asian diaspora is spreading. And that is how we, in terms of, again, human migrations and literally our own future genetic footprint, is going to be altered by the next wave of genetic mingling among races that will occur as a result of the mass migrations that are being unleashed today because of climate, geopolitics, and other forces. And that's actually where the book ends.
Which in itself really makes this concept of a nationality something that's very amorphic, in the future. Right. To finish us off, let's get a bit even more sci-fi if we can. Take us out over the next 30 to 50 years and beyond. What is it that really excites you about the future? What is it that, because all of us as futurists, we tend to be in a rush to get to the future. We tend to be optimistic about the future. What is it that you're most optimistic about? And obviously, we've got a lot of challenges coming up over the next 20 to 30 years. But as we come through the other side of that, what do you think human society would be like?
This is, both an analytical answer and a normative one, a project that I've been pursuing and advocating for a long time. And I think its time has come, which is to basically denationalize passports, to denationalize mobility. The very idea of the passport, of course, is that your identity is tied to your, the country in which you were born that issued you that identity. But now that we have so much data about ourselves that we can put online, blockchain, what are our skills, our criminal history, our travel history, our financial records, we can make a case for ourselves to be treated as individuals, not as citizen of X, and therefore free Y should let me in based on who I am, not where I came from. And we have all the technology, all of the capacity, even some degree the diplomatic will to get to that system. And I think we're going to get there actually sooner than we think, despite the rigidity of the heavily bureaucratized system of migration that we have imposed over the past century in particular.
Because immigration is going to have to be competitive, right, in the future.
Exactly right.
Race for talent.
Well, a war for young talent.
Yeah. Parag Khanna, thank you so very much for joining us on the Futurists all the way from Singapore. So good to see you again. And what a great set of information you shared with us today. Multiple perspectives from the other side of the planet. Always a great pleasure. Thank you for joining us. Brett, you want to round us up here?
Sure, absolutely. So Parag, where can people find out more information about yourself and the books?
ParagKhanna.com has everything about me in the books. ClimateAlpha.ai is the company.
And are you working on a new book?
I am. You'd like it. It's called Citizens of Everywhere. So
awesome.
You've called me very kindly a global citizen many times in this conversation. I refer to myself as a citizen of everywhere, and I explain why, what that means as a concept, and why I think it is something of a kind of principle that young people can latch onto.
Well, when you're ready to launch the book, let's get you back on.
I appreciate that. I'd love to.
In the meantime, if you like the show, don't forget to tweet us out, give us a 5-star review on iTunes, Podcaster, Google Play, Amazon, wherever it is you listen to your podcasts, and share the show. Tweet it out, put it out on social media, wherever you can give us a little bit of a hand. It is definitely appreciated. If there's certain futurists or guests you'd like to have appear on the Futurist, please let us know also. But for now, my thanks go out to the production team, to Sylvie Johnson, Carlo Navarro on the social media side, to Kevin Hersham, our audio engineer, Elizabeth Severance, and the rest of the team at Provoke Media help us put this together every week. But we will be back with another sterling futurist guest next week. And until then, we'll see you in the future.
Well, that's it for the Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.